Hello, Ginny. Welcome to our first case study discussion. So ZMH has built an investor engagement dashboard that allows companies to better prepare for the shareholder engagement process. We're delighted to have you on this recording. So Ginny, just tell a little, maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself and how you used to prepare for shareholder engagement when you were in-house.
First of all, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited about giving other people the opportunity to see this platform, because had I been in-house 2 years ago, this would have saved me an enormous amount of time during shareholder engagement season. It's got a lot of information right at your fingertips. I worked in-house as through various corporate positions and as general counsel at Norfolk Southern Corporation for 34 years. Retired 2 years ago. One of my primary duties throughout that whole time was shareholder engagement. I spent a lot of time on shareholder proposals and then developed our shareholder engagement program, and then eventually helped steer the company through a proxy contest, which really does sharpen your shareholder engagement skills. What we used to do is to prepare for shareholder engagement was we would start right after the annual meeting and go back and analyze the voting data, come up with a list of our top holders, other thought leaders, come up with a good list of who we wanted to engage with, and of course get our governance and nominating committee involved in the roadmap that we laid out of how we wanted to do shareholder engagement. Then we would start trying to gather contact information for investors. That was often a labor-intensive process, depending on how much movement there was, and people had often changed jobs throughout the year. So sometimes it would be back and forth trying to gather that information, but then we would eventually send out email requests for engagement summaries. At that point, we would go back and try and plan our engagements, come up with what the common themes were, what we needed to talk about, and really dig into each individual investor. So we would read through and summarize the investor guidelines for each investor of how they were going to vote. We looked at our engagement notes from the prior year. We thought about what might come up. If we knew common themes that were going to arise, we would reach out to other people we knew in the governance community, try and get more intel from them, try and put together sort of a good sort of skeleton of talking points for how we wanted to respond to issues that were important to each individual investor, and where we were complying and where we needed to have more conversations around their voting guidelines. And then once we started the shareholder engagement process, we would take very detailed notes that we could use in the next year and share with our board of directors.
Great, that's tremendously helpful, Ginny. So let's walk through how the investor engagement dashboard would help facilitate that process. So the first action item you mentioned was understanding how investors voted at the prior shareholder meeting. Would that be a good starting point, Ginny? So let's take the example of BlackRock, because they are usually a top investor in most of the companies. So in our dashboard, we have different modules. And if you go to the NPX dashboard module, you click on BlackRock, and we'll work with the example of IBM here. So we select IBM, we select the year 2022, and here you get information on how BlackRock voted at IBM's 2022 shareholder meeting, and we also capture the voting rationale as to why they voted against a certain proposal or an item. Here you can see BlackRock voted against a proposal to reduce ownership threshold to call a special meeting, and the reason why. Similarly, we see why BlackRock voted against the election of a director and the reason why. So I think from our vantage point, this is an intel that would be tremendously valuable for IBM when they're engaging with BlackRock in year 2, knowing why BlackRock voted a certain way. What are your thoughts on this, Ginny?
Yeah, I agree. This is extremely helpful. It puts all the information right here at your fingertips. And also it gives you an ability to go back and look at other companies as well, not just at your own company. One of the other key points that I didn't go into detail on in our process without this tool was educating the engagement team too. As you're putting together all of the information and all of your background materials, keep in mind you're going to have an engagement team of relatively new people. It's suffice it to say the engagement topics change from year to year, which means the people on your team are going to change from year to year. So you really need to think about how to get everyone educated and up to speed so that when you get on the call and can start talking, they understand the investor that they're talking to. And so all of this information, everything you just showed is really helpful for that.
Absolutely. And I think like the way we've tried to solve that issue about information gap is by creating these board ready investor profiles. So here again, going back using the BlackRock example, here's an example of BlackRock's ESG profile. It's curated using a lot of intel that BlackRock has on the stewardship website, and it includes the team members, engagement. I'll quickly, so you can actually see who the team members are here.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, especially if
Yes.
you're going to have directors involved in your engagement. They always want to know who they're talking to, what the title is, and just seeing the picture helps
Exactly.
create a visual connection.
And you can we also capture information on how do you engage with them, plus a lot of like recent intel on BlackRock. Mike, who's also a senior member of the ZMH team, Mike has been instrumental in putting this together. Mike, any thoughts on like what are the key issues we're trying to get across?
Yeah, well, I think one of the main goals we try to achieve when we design these investor profile pages is we wanted to help corporations understand the chain and the hierarchy of who they're actually going to be talking with. And so what we try and do on page one is we try and trace that line from the head of the organization, from the CEO, all the way down to the head of stewardship and or the head of engagement. And then on the subsequent pages, what we try and do is capture the individual associates and colleagues within the enterprise that actually participate in the engagement. So these are the people that you are more than likely going to see when you schedule an appointment for engagement with BlackRock. So that's the first challenge that we tried to try to undertake. The second challenge was trying to help corporations understand how do you engage and how do you contact these investors to begin your engagement. And so in every profile, we capture in a gray box the contact information. BlackRock is unique in the sense that they have their own site that's set up for registration. So it's their own sub website, but the majority of funds have an actual email address where you can send those requests in, and it's a generic email box that their stewardship team monitors, and that's how the engagement process begins. The next challenge that we tried to address was, what are the priorities? What do you need to know going into the meeting with each individual investment fund? So if you scroll back to page one, this is the sample format that we use and we replicate for each investor. We try and highlight on page one the top engagement priorities, and then underneath that, any type of reporting expectations and voting parameters that they may prescribe. It may be something as simple as the gender diversity mandate. Some funds choose to vote against a company if they don't have a 30% or some sort of threshold of gender diversity on the board. So we try and capture and reflect those items here so that corporations understand what the issues are that are top of mind on the investor, and then they can do a scrub against their own provisions to see if they're in compliance from a voting perspective with any new mandates that come about. And then finally, what we tried to illustrate is on the right-hand side, the sensitivity in terms of how these companies are engaging, how these funds are engaging with companies, and the level of engagement by theme. And the themes are environmental, social, and governance. And a majority of the funds spend a lot of time engaging on the governance side, because governance covers compensation, it covers board of directors. But what we've seen in the past is that more and more engagement has occurred on social and environmental issues. The last box on this page captures the voting tendencies with regard to shareholder proposals. So this represents how likely BlackRock is to vote against a governance-related shareholder proposal versus a social-related proposal versus an environmental proposal. So
Ginny, let me jump in. Let me jump in with my highlights to what you just said. The little gray box in the bottom left corner of the screen here is incredibly valuable. As anyone watching this knows, you spin your wheels a lot in emailing the wrong person, emailing someone that's left, emailing someone that's now relying on a group email. So having that information right there, right off the bat, saves you an enormous amount of time. And then secondly, the engagement priorities and the snapshot of the prior years on the left and the right, in the middle of the screen that Michael just walked through, is really, that's all you need to give your engagement team background information on really what is BlackRock all about and what are they going to want to talk about. And from there, you can immediately jump into planning how you want to respond, identifying what your issues are, and then, think about shareholder proposals and anything that might be unique for you from the prior year or even the upcoming year.
Sure. Great. So one question that we often get asked when clients are looking at this at the dashboard is how frequently do we update this information? We use cutting edge technology, AI, and a lot of tools on the back end to actually monitor and track investors in real time.
That's great. That's great. Do you want to go back for a minute to the investor profile page and highlight the links at the bottom? There's some really, really helpful links there under the engagement materials as well.
Definitely. So Mike,
Sure.
You want to quickly talk about these?
Sure. So there are two bits of data that we find is extremely useful to GCs and people in the IR role. Those two pieces of data are the voting manuals. Okay, so they're proxy voting guidelines. So each year, investors publish their updated guidelines to prescribe exactly how they're going to vote and what tendencies and what new thresholds that they're going to adopt in their practices. And then any type of annual stewardship reporting that the fund publishes throughout the year. And so obviously BlackRock is one of the leading institutional investors, and they publish quite a bit of material every quarter. And so what we do is we try and highlight the main documents that contain the statistics for engagement, as well as any type of voting briefs and any other voting guidelines and mandates that they may issue that relate to stewardship and their voting. Obviously, BlackRock has the Larry Fink CEO letter that they publish every year. So we try and have a link to the latest letter so that companies can click and review that and in a very quick and efficient manner, understand exactly what the mandate is for the organization and how that's going to impact likely their meeting and their engagement with the fund ongoing.
Okay. So
those are all incredibly helpful links that save you a lot of time, but also the other aspect to having it all there is that you're not missing something as well. When we're doing it ourselves, sometimes you never really know if you've found everything that you need to find on the website. So that's very helpful there.
And while we are on the topic of proxy voting guidelines, maybe we can quickly talk about the digital version of the proxy voting guidelines that are in the dashboard. So I mean, one issue that we often heard was like people need to like find these voting guidelines and save them on their PCs and then scan through them for the key words or key searches. So what we have done is we've digitized all the proxy voting guidelines, including those for the two proxy advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis. So going back to the BlackRock example, so we can click on BlackRock, and if you're searching for just board of directors on BlackRock, you can click results, and here is a digital version of the proxy voting guidelines for BlackRock. That is also searchable. And you can see there are subcategories on accountability, board composition, diversity. So this is a smart search engine where you can search multiple investors at the same time. If you want to search BlackRock, we can search by keyword search. We can search by, let's say, board diversity, and it'll show you everywhere where the BlackRock has mentioned diversity in the policy voting guidelines.
That's very helpful. And the search capabilities too is great.
Thank you. So this is, so Ginny, going back to the process that you manage. So we've talked about getting some intel on what are the key priorities for these investors. How have they voted? We have now access to the proxy voting guidelines. What is the next step in the engagement journey?
Yeah, so if you think about the timeline, I'll start with May is the annual meeting for Norfolk Southern. So that's what I'm used to. So June, we start thinking about June and July, we're planning. July and August, we're reaching out to investors, setting up meetings. By fall, we're talking to people, and we would have already accessed all this information, and we would be in the middle of our engagement season, really focused on how investors voted the prior year. And then all of a sudden it's shareholder proposal season, and the shareholder proposals come in. So at that point, you're switching gears real quick to try and come up with some information about what does that shareholder proposal mean to your company? How have investors voted on it in the past, and what's likely to happen that year? And you might need to try and figure out, are there certain investors that this is going to be really important to? And do we need to start giving them some basic background information on, it's not the time to start soliciting votes without filing, proper materials. But there is an ability at that point to figure out, is there some background information about your company that they're not aware of, and you need to educate them. So that's where I think some of the case studies and the more detailed information on specific proposals would be very helpful.
Sure. That's a great point. So going back to the BlackRock example, so in our dashboard, you can select BlackRock. We can say environmental, we can pick 2022 as a year, and we can drill deep down into a shareholder proposal. And these are case studies that have been disclosed by investors in the stewardship reports, on their website, in podcasts, in articles. Any place they disclose a case study, we capture it using technology. A good example would be McDonald's. We click on review, and here you would see an example of a case study where BlackRock engaged with McDonald's on environmental issue in 2022. And this was regarding a shareholder proposal to report on efforts to reduce plastic use. BlackRock voted against this proposal. Here's the reason why they voted against. This is the engagement detail. And you can also click on the link to the source document. So we actually capture all the vote bulletins in the dashboard itself. So as to Ginny, to your point, as any company is doing research on, hey, who got this proposal environmental? How did the investor vote on it, and why? You can do that research using the platform.
Which is very helpful, because at this time too, you're most likely going to be reaching out to the shareholder proponent, having conversations. Your nominating or governance committee is going to want to know what the investor base is likely to think about it, and is going to be in discussions with you about whether or not you want to perhaps negotiate some sort of a resolution. So all of this information is very helpful in informing those decisions.
Right. And the other sort of another point, Ginny, you mentioned was understanding what are the recent investor engagements been for these investors. So as a firm, we help many of our clients engage with the top investors, and we get real-time intel in what are these issues that matter most to these investors. And that information is captured in the dashboard on a no-name basis. It's basically clients are good with us providing this information because it helps the broader community of companies. So going back to, like, let's say BlackRock, you can or we can select all investors here, and you can see the different topics each of these investors have focused on in recent engagement with clients. And obviously this varies from industry to industry, but it gives you a good sense of what is top of mind for these investors in real time.
I think this is really helpful. I also like the idea of its labor-intensive process in-house to take detailed notes on the engagement for your own records, but you've got it all right here and have the ability to allow other companies to use your own data to help in their results.
Right. Absolutely. So I think like this definitely is a high value add from a client's point of view. And it helps them frame their strategy accordingly, because they get to see what are these investors focused on, and they can prepare those responses accordingly.
Absolutely. That's great.
Right. So what would be the remaining steps in this like engagement journey from your vantage point, Jenny?
Well, I think we've covered all of the primary topics, and if on the shareholder engagement cycle at this point, you're probably getting towards, gearing up for next year's annual meeting. The only topic we haven't touched on is one that is not everyday common topic at companies, but what if you get have a proxy contest, or what if you are fearing a proxy contest? How do you have any information that companies can use that would help for in defending or deciding what approach to take on a proxy contest?
Right. So that's a great point. So we do capture that information in different areas. So obviously we can go to NPX, and you can look up how an investor voted at a proxy fight. That gives you good intel on like whether investors supported a campaign or voted against a campaign. So you can get that information from the NPX dashboard. In case studies, again, you can look at like case studies, and here's an example of in our dashboard, if you want to search by proxy contest, right? How investors have voted on proxy contests, you can select all investors, you can hit results, and here are case studies where that the investor actually disclosed how they voted and why. So here's an example of a Neuberger Berman at CoreLogic. They disclosed a case study why they vote for the dissident, why they voted for the dissident and removal of directors. And here's a reason why Neuberger did that. So again, like the case studies are based on disclosures from certain investors. Not every investor discloses every single case study, but wherever the information is disclosed, we capture that intel. Ginny, before we wrap up, there's one new module that we have been working on. I wanted to get your thoughts on it. And this module basically captures all the engagement details and different topics of engagement that various investors have disclosed in the stewardship reports and on the website. Here is an example of the industrial sector. And for 2022, so we're looking at various investors, like starting with BlackRock. So BlackRock has basically in various places reported that they engage with AAR Corp on compensation issue in 2020. So you can actually go down the list for various investors. We have over 400 records over here, and you can actually see like how, if you were doing like industry peer benchmarking, you can do that over here. So we can pick like, let's say, technology sector, and you can search by technology, right? And you can see what are the topics of engagement for various investors on regarding technology. And we can even do this by company. So your prior company, Union Pacific. So we can go here and see like what are investors disclosing about their engagement with Union Pacific. What are your thoughts on this type of data that we have collected.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful in planning shareholder engagement. I didn't mention, but we always went back and looked at our peer companies that were in the industry and tried to gather as much information, or sometimes just reached out to them and called our contacts to find out what was being discussed for them from other investors, because it's commonly similar topics across an industry, especially when it comes to environmental and social issues. And on shareholder proposals, typically if we had not gotten a shareholder proposal the prior year, but one comes in, we can often look to, we're able to look to another railroad and see how it was handled, and get some insight on how it's going to be received among our investor base. So I think this information is really helpful as well.
Great. Thank you so much. So this module will be up live on our dashboard within the next couple of weeks. So it will be another tool that our clients have to do peer benchmarking, peer analysis, and get very detailed level of insight on each investor and what are the engagement topics for them.
That's great.
All right. So I think this has been hopefully, Ginny, informative in terms of highlighting how companies can use the dashboard to sort of prepare for their shareholder engagement. Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap up?
No, not for me. I just think it's very exciting that this much information is available. So not just does it help save valuable in-house time, it also will lead to better engagements, because the more informed your team is, the better your shareholder engagements are going to be.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Ginny. We appreciate you being on this call with us.
Thank you.